Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome from Spring Berlin, Germany. My name is Daniel Stesser, Vice President Business Development, Aviation Software, and it's a big honor to have you all with us today for the next monthly Aviation Women panel. It's, by the way, the 32nd since 2020 when we started Ladies Beyond Flying. And today we really have a fantastic guest speaker, Noreen Newton from Canada. And I'm very thankful that Noreen also encouraged me to proceed with Ladies Beyond Flying, because you remember, Noreen, we had a conversation a couple months back. It was very close. I was almost about to give it up, and you encouraged me to keep going. I'm very grateful that you helped me. You were also one of the decisive contributors to our mission statement. Also, big thank you for that. And today you talk about very interesting things, because you're going to talk about equity, diversity, inclusivity, and you want to talk about the differences. And so for all in the audience, we have agreed with Noreen that we are going to record her presentation, her talk, and then we stop the recording, that nobody feels somehow, say, threatened from a recording, social media impact after, so that everybody is open to share all personal opinions. And that has been agreed with Noreen. Noreen, stage is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. And shout out to everybody that's here. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. I was intrigued by Daniel's name for this organization when he started it, which was Old Gals Club. And I don't know why you got pushback, but being a member of the Old Boys Club and fighting the Old Boys Club as a female is it was intrigued me that this is a club that I should belong to. So moving forward, I'm at the end of my career as a pilot, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but I'll also share with you a little bit about my research. And regarding not recording the conversation, I'm a big believer that we have to be able to add voices, and we have to be able to add different points of view without this coming back to bite us in the butt. So without further ado, I haven't prepared anything because I've been flying. I've been training on a new airplane, and it's been taking a lot of my time. So I'll just talk a little bit first about my research and who I am. I want to start with a quote from Martin Luther King. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And in the aviation industry, women's voices have been silenced historically. We're seeing a change, and I'm grateful to see Carlene here, who I have not met, but who I am very familiar with her story. I wouldn't go so far as to speak about it, but I'm hoping to hear from her later. And another person that I want to quote here is Galileo, who said, "One cannot teach a man anything. One can only enable him to learn from within himself." So I'm talking to you about my 45 years since I started flying airplanes. And there has been, as I say, many changes in the airline industry in that time. So I'll tell you a story that happened in March 2022. Post-COVID, I was sitting at the international departures at Vancouver Airport with another pilot who we were talking about retirement. We were talking about what we were going to do. He's a little bit younger than me, but you know, the airline had offered packages to a lot of the pilots, and we'd lost I think close to 200 pilots, and we were sitting the appropriate 6 feet apart. in front of the Tim Hortons, which was closed, and down the hall came a first officer. So I'm sitting there in my pilot's uniform, and 6 feet away was Richard. And Richard is a male. He is around my age, gray-haired, slight paunch, taller, but we're sitting down, and he has the mustache, and he looks like a pilot. I apparently don't. So this younger first officer walked up to Richard, who was looking at me, so he wasn't really paying attention. We were engaged in conversation. He looked up, he went to, I beg your pardon, Richard, and he said, "Are you Noreen?" And Richard didn't look up. We kept talking, and then he leaned in again and he said, "Are you Noreen?" And Richard looked up and he goes, "No." And I just thought, oh, here we go. I knew that this was the first officer I was going to be flying with because I'd looked at the flight plan. So I made some assumptions based on the name of on the flight plan. So this gentleman walked away, and as he was walking away, I thought, oh, I got to say something. So I shouted at him. I said, "I'm Noreen." And he said, "No, you're not." And he kept on walking. Didn't even look back. Kept on walking. I'm like, here we go. Down the hall now walks one of our flight attendants who I worked with for 30 years. And I said, "Oh, Maria, you're not going to believe what just happened." And I relayed this story, and she said, "Oh my God, Noreen, I hope he's going to come out of the cockpit in tears." And I said, "Well, no, of course he isn't." Anyways, we walked down to the boarding gate, and I said, I left my bags with her, and I said, "I'm just going to go walk. I'm going to go use the washroom, and I'll be right with you." And I walked right by this first officer again, who didn't look up. I walked into the washroom. I came out, and he was standing there, looking a little bit chagrined, and he said to me, he looked at me, he said, "Noreen must be a male because Noreen is the captain." So to say that things have changed, they have, but we still have a long way to go. There are basic assumptions about cultural assumptions about what constitutes a pilot and what the image of the professional pilot is that still need to change. So that leads us to our conversation today, which is about being differently different and how everyone in an organization should be supported to follow their own aspirations to the level of their ambition. And that quote comes from Simon Fanshawe, who wrote a book called The Power of Difference, where the complexities of diversity and inclusion meet practical solutions. So I have been a pilot since I took my first flying lesson in April of 1978. And I'm situated on the West Coast of North America. So my experience is from a Western white female's perspective. I flew for 8 years. I started out as a flight instructor. The industry was vastly different in 1978 than it was now. Women were in fact, 1978 was the first year that our national airline, Air Canada, hired a female. As I mentioned before, there was a lot of pushback to having women on the flight deck. So I worked up north. I instructed for a couple of years, and then I went up north to be a bush pilot in northern Canada. In order to do that, I was the chief flight instructor of a small flying school that had a charter license, so we would fly up in northern Canada to support the oil rigs. So this was off airport flying, and I stayed there for just short of 4 years before I eventually got on with the company that I've been with for 37 years now, which has been through several iterations. I started out it was called ABC, and then it became Jazz Aviation. We were owned by Air Canada, but several different iterations along the way. And like I say, in 33 weeks, I will be retiring. I will be aging out of the aviation industry, and with 45 years. So it's been a great ride. I'm thoroughly enjoyed it, and learned lots along the way. So I'll
But by
share
the
with
way,
you.
Noreen, that leads me to the first question. Are you for or against this retirement age for pilots? Because there's also the debate in the industry why pilots have to retire, why they cannot keep going and fly.
I think if you can maintain your medical and your qualifications, absolutely you should be able to fly. Personally, I think I've had enough. I'm retiring from the flight deck. I'll let you know how that goes, but I don't intend to retire from the industry. I'm not going to be silenced by my age or my gray hair, my postmenopausal body. So I think that there is I think that there are people who would be welcome to continue to fly. It's been an ongoing discussion over the years, but ageism, right? Is that something, that's something else. That's another story, right? So I just switched airplanes. I've just learned a completely new airplane. So it's not like, and my experiences, I think, should be valued. So does that answer your question diplomatically enough?
Absolutely.
Okay. So in 2017, I went back to graduate school. And the reason I did was because the organization had put out a call for promoting female leaders. This group was called FLAG, Female Leadership Advisory Group, and they did a survey, and they posted the results of the survey, and at that time there was less than 7%, around 7% of the pilot population was female, and I believe worldwide it's, some organizations have more. I think India does best, Air India maybe, or airlines in India, with around 12 to 13% of the pilot population is female. And we were, as I say, around 7%. And I was a little bit gobsmacked because, as I say, I had around 29 years at this organization. And so I chose to go back to and do a master's degree. And my research, which you can Google, was on women's experience in the aviation industry, and it was called. My thesis was called "Equal Space on the Flight Deck: Challenging the Myth of the Professional Pilot." And it was an appreciative inquiry in that I wanted to learn from women's experience. What could their experience tell me about increasing or inviting women to join the aviation industry? And so I set out to interview 9 women. It was limited by the kind of interviewing that I was doing, which was face-to-face or interviewing. Anyways, I wanted to understand how women have confronted the barriers and how their experience can inform a cultural shift. So the women that I interviewed were between 20 to 40 years of experience, and they went from wide body captains who had, as I say, almost 40 years experience, or much the same experience as I had, though my story is nowhere in my research, and first officers. I had one flight operations manager, one woman who was a first officer for an aerial fire suppression, which so a water bomber pilot. yeah, there was about 9 women with lots of experience, and their stories were fascinating. And it was also interesting the difference between the women who had 40 years, who were the wide body captains, and those who weren't, excuse me, who hadn't been in the industry quite as long. But they all told stories of being excluded from the flight deck. So despite the sexism, despite these women being told they weren't welcome, literally being told that they would not have jobs because they were women, they persisted as women do, and they achieved leadership roles in the industry. And the image of the professional pilot, the culture of the aviation industry, promoted a professional pilot as a heroic male, and that women were actually found lacking. I was talking a little bit about Helen Ritchie, who in 1936 was hired as the first woman, first officer, and she was hired at a time when the industry was trying to get women in, I beg your pardon, passengers in the seats of airplanes. And the industry was saying flying is so safe that even women can do it. And the pushback came from the Airline Pilots Association that if she was hired, that they would actually go on strike. And so she was not able to fly passengers. I think she was accommodated for a short period of time, flying mail, I believe. And sadly, she committed suicide. So that's a very sad story. So moving forward in 2022, that we still see a cultural bias towards males in the industry, as I tried to demonstrate with my anecdote. So, sorry, Daniel.
Yeah, there's a question from Mariana. Mariana, you want to ask a question now or a little bit later?
It's okay. I can ask now also because it was already from the previous topic. So, hi Noreen, Mariana, thank you so much for being with us today. I just wanted to go back a bit to the previous topic where you were mentioning that the retirement age rules sometimes may not make sense. I think from a previous talk that we had here on the group, there was also a discussion around I think it's the limit for female pilots that are pregnant, and I think it was a Southeast Asian country where they had changed the legislation recently to limit pregnant women from flying after, I think it was 6 months. And I honestly have no understanding on the topic, but would love to hear your thoughts on this. If you ever encounter this, if you think there should be a limitation, or if you think in some cases perhaps like the retirement age, there's some exaggeration as well. Just would like to hear on that.
Okay, so this is a little bit sideways, but I would love to talk about that. I actually did have 2 children, 2 sons, to give birth to 2 children while I was working. So Transport Canada does mandate, and I believe it's 36 weeks. But honestly, with flying at high altitudes, there has been medical evidence shown that it does affect your health. So I don't know a lot about the research, and I'm sure there's maybe other people who could talk about it. But when I became pregnant, and I was older because I wanted to fly airplanes, and I had actually been turned down. Oh no, I hadn't been turned down, but I had been asked when I was about 23 whether I was pregnant, and I was a little bit gobsmacked again, because I know that that's not something you're supposed to ask. But I wasn't going to have that opportunity. So it's a very I became pregnant at 30. I think I was about 37. Maybe 38. And there was no uniform. They didn't even, I simply went and bought blue pants with stretchy elastic waists and left my shirt untucked. And pilots will say, well, Noreen, you're kind of looking, you're looking a little bit disheveled. And I'm like, well, there was no uniform. There was no consideration for women. There was no accommodation for leave of absence for being pregnant. And these are all things that have happened in the last 40 years. And like I say, there's probably other women who can talk about it. Maternity leave, right? We had to fight for maternity leave. I had the chief flight attendant. I was getting a flight plan from a computer, and she said, "Oh, you're looking rather thick around the middle." And I'm like, "Yeah, 4 or 5 months pregnant." So it is medical. Transport Canada and their medical requirements are, I believe, need to be updated, and that's probably another topic for another day that I don't necessarily, I'm not an expert to talk about. Does that answer? Does that help?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, it was good to hear. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so we can talk about, I just want to talk about culture a little bit, because a huge part of my research was on the culture of the aviation industry. And when you're doing your master's, you don't necessarily have to go out and find, new ideas. So you actually get to look at the research that all has already been done. And Edgar Schein was one of the experts who I used a lot, and I still use a lot. He was a professor emeritus from, I believe, MIT. And he just recently passed away. He was 93, so very inspirational guy. But his definition for culture, he wrote a lot about organizational culture. And when I talk about culture, there's different macro and micro cultures, but organizational culture is defined by Edgar Schein as an accumulated shared learning of that group. So that's a shared learning, a pattern of systems of beliefs, values, and norms that come to be taken for granted as basic assumptions and eventually drop out of awareness. So the aviation industry emerged from after the Second World War out of the military. And so pilots that were hired by the airlines were the same pilots that were flying in the military. They wouldn't allow women to fly post Second World War in the military. In fact, it wasn't until 1979 in Canada that they allowed the first woman to fly in the military. So this excluded women. The image of the professional pilot was that of a white, paternal, heroic male. And the Airline Pilots Association has written about this, and they intentionally communicated that this was what why the airline pilot deserved high wages, because of his heroic behavior, that if you were in good hands, and if something were to happen, he could single-handedly fly the aircraft to the ground safely and land it. So, but supported by the nurses in the back, the women, who were mostly women in the back of the airplanes who served the customers. So that was the culture. It came out of the military, and I believe we are still. It is still very masculinized because of it. When we think of what an airline pilot, when we think of the image of an airline pilot, we do not think about me. We do not see. I am constantly reminded by the rest of my staff, even though, as I say, I've been working for 37 years for the same company. I'm often offered the paperwork, the passenger manifest, or told, even though I wear the same uniform, or told that we're just waiting for the pilot. Or so it's the assumption, this assumption that is in the industry is that women serve, women work in the back of the airplane, and that men are the pilots. So what I found in my research was that the women who became captains on these wide-body aircraft found their leadership style. They performed to a masculinized leadership style, which was command and control. When assessed, that was how they could perform. But when they were actually acting in their job, when they were given agency, when they were not being assessed, they were build relationships. And one in particular, one woman who I interviewed, who was a 787 captain who has since retired, talked about relationships, building relationships. And she said, you know, if the airline believed that one person could do this job, one person could act as a pilot. Now, a 787 overseas operations has four pilots, so a captain, and they're relief first officers. I don't even believe that they have flight engineers. So she said, I'm going to encourage you to speak up, and you've got to, if you see something, you've got to say something. And this is, we talk about that as a skill, a CRM skill, but in my experience, women are still, can still be silenced, and first officers can still be silenced. But that is another conversation for another day. So how do we find our voice? We have to be encouraged. We have to build relationships and understand that regardless of our position, whether it's as a first officer or a fueling the airplane, an agent, we have to be able to add our voice, a flight attendant. And that is where I believe women shine, by building relationships and encouraging voice. But they have to be allowed to, they cannot be silenced. And that is where we talk about differences. So how do we value our differences? We are all different, each of us. Differences are the norm, right? I had one union leader say to me that we're homogenous. He said we're all the same. Now we are trained to the same levels, to the same capacity, but we are not all the same. And that is, I said, no, that's where you're wrong. We are not all the same. We are not. My experience, my life experience is vastly different. I have been silenced throughout most of my career, but because I'm persistent and because I really wanted to be there, I added my voice, but that doesn't mean that I haven't experienced the feeling of being devalued because of the body that I occupy. I had one when I was a first officer many years ago, and I stayed as a captain probably because of these kinds of experience where the captain on the first flight with me, we were flying the 146, and we were going, I'm not sure, I think we were going to Calgary. And the first flight of the day, I was doing the walk around on the aircraft. He came up to me and he put his arm around me, pulled me in tight around my waist, pulled me up tight, and he said, if I told you had nice breasts, would you hold them against me? Would you hold it against me? And he completely diminished me. And this sort of drip of sexism is still pervasive in the industry. I just did a line check with a training captain, and the whole banter was sexualized, and it's exhausting. We're tired of it. After this incident with the captain, I went to my chief pilot, and he was having nothing of it. He said, well, you're going to go flying, aren't you? And this was, I don't even think there was such a thing as human resources in the aviation industry at that time. And I said, of course I'm going flying. And we went to Calgary. And when we got to Calgary, I said, well, to the captain, before we went our separate ways to the hotel, I said, I just want you to know that I actually spoke to the chief pilot about what you said to me and how you made me feel. No, I shouldn't say that. How I felt. He didn't make me feel anyway. How I felt diminished. I felt like you know, all my experience, all my professionalism was completely discounted because I was objectified. He said, well, I'm not in trouble, am I? I said, no, you're not in trouble. Of course, you're not in trouble. So, and he wasn't in trouble. And I actually, at the time, spoke to a lawyer who was a friend of mine. Most of my peers weren't in the aviation industry. They were lawyers for some reason. And I wasn't going to, I didn't want to make an example of him. I just wanted change. I wanted to understand how to create change. And I was basically shut down, but that was many years ago. Anyways, so how do we value differences? Well, we have to be curious. We have to be curious about the other. And we're not all one kind. Women have been considered one kind of pilot. They're, found to be lacking because the default pilot is considered to be male. And I find that post-COVID, we can have this conversation more. There seems to have been some recognition that there are certain skills, and I'm not going to call them soft skills because they're not soft. They are skills that women bring that are slightly different than that. I should say women and some men. It's not a binary. It's not either or. Anyways, so towards valuing differences, we have to be curious about the people that we're working with. We have to have conversations, the people in the industry, and we have to learn to listen. I want to say that though the people who have discriminated against me have been males, I have also been lifted up. So I find it necessary to consider everybody, that there isn't one kind of male or one kind of female. And so I value because I was one of very few women. Of course, there were the opportunities. Many of the opportunities were presented by men who it didn't matter. They saw maybe or understood my struggle, maybe not, but they didn't make any difference to them that I didn't have the body parts that might have been considered necessary. So when we talk about culture and cultural assumptions indicate a lack of curiosity. So we have to be curious about other people's experience, and because life experience is what creates the differences we all bring. And I find right now, and this is why I wanted to have a conversation with the video off, because people are wary to identify differences because of the belief that if everyone is the same, we won't discriminate against one another. And absolutely, there are biases out there. We stereotype people. We look at people. We make assumptions. Like, that's what I'm trying to say. Is there a certain assumptions made about me, even if I wear the same uniform, but because of the body that I occupy, we gather partial truths, and I'm guilty of it as well. These partial truths, we force them into bias and discrimination, and a lot of training doesn't work, right? When we're telling somebody something, as opposed to asking them questions about their experience, when we're telling them, we're creating that hierarchy, which needs to actually be flattened a little bit. Hierarchy is necessary. We have to have somebody who bears the ultimate responsibility for the safety of the aircraft, but that person also has to be able to demonstrate that they, through relationships, will value the conversation that the other the experiences that other people bring, because I can guarantee you that it isn't just about showing up. We need to learn from the other people that we're flying with. I come to work with every day, and regardless of what the experience level of who I'm flying with, I learn from them. If they're a 250-hour college graduate, or if they're a 40-year experienced captain, I can learn something every time I come to work. And I believe that is how we have to approach our differences, is learning from each other. And how do we learn? We learn through conversation. So this training, we can't train biases out of people. We have to be able to have conversations without fear of retribution, without fear of being canceled or losing our job because of our differences. So I would like to see this culture of hierarchy or masculinized values change to create a culture of belonging. And that is where a culture of belonging will encourage voices of different people. So how to do that? We have to engage employees to listen to each other. We have the organization, whether it's in training, like this first officer that I was flying with, I asked him, had a conversation with him. How long had he been in the industry? Why was he surprised that a woman would be a captain? And he said he'd been in the industry for 10 years, and he'd been to college. He was a flight instructor when he was laid off during COVID. And he'd been a number of years at the airline. Why was there no conversations about when he was onboarded as to the culture? And well, I think that he wasn't, because this is the dominant worker. Sorry, you guys, I just got to turn my. Anyway, sorry about that. A phone call just happened. So the dominant worker, they don't necessarily think about other people, and they don't question whether they belong, because they've never had to. So I would just ask that we create a culture of belonging by being curious about the other, listening, and to start the process of conscious change, to not assume that your norm is their norm. So, and I have to do that as well. Don't assume because somebody is different. We fly. I've noticed a huge change in the number, but also the different cultures that are hired as pilots, and it's great to see. They're not all white males, and but as I say, we have to start the conversation, and this is it. We're here doing that right now. Yeah. So, like I say, as Martin Luther King said, our lives begin the day we become silent about things that matter, and this matters a lot to me. Creating a culture of belonging where women's voices are valued. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Noreen. I think I'm now going to stop the recording.
Okay. Thank you.
And thank you.